Hey everyone, this is Paras Chopra, and today I'm with Dr. Philip Goff, who's a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Durham in the UK. He's the author of a book called Galileo's Error, which I have with me here, in which he defends panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world. He acknowledges it sounds a bit crazy, but in his book and research papers, he tries to show that it avoids the difficulties faced by its rivals, which is materialism, that says consciousness can be explained in terms of physical processes in the brain, and dualism, that says consciousness is separate from the body and the brain. Panpsychism suggests everything around us is conscious, and it's definitely a radical and a bold claim, and that's what we are going to investigate today. Welcome, Dr. Philip Goff. Thanks for making our time today.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting.
Fantastic. So I did want to start by understanding about your motivation and your career trajectory. How did you end up getting interested in the problem of consciousness, and how's your career evolved around this problem?
Yeah, I guess I've always been interested in things that it's hard to fit into our standard theory of reality. And that's not because I like kind of reveling in mystery. Some people think, with my views, I must like a mystery. But it's actually quite the opposite. It frustrates me, when something doesn't fit in and we don't know what to do with it. So there are a number of phenomena like this that philosophers worry about. For example, facts about, free will might be something that's hard. Human agency, human freedom might be hard to fit into the deterministic scientific story, or approximately deterministic scientific story. Or facts about value, facts about right and wrong, good or bad. How do they fit into our scientific story of cold-blooded empirical facts? Or abstract objects like numbers or sets. If you go in a mathematics department, they seem to be discovering all these facts about numbers, but numbers don't seem to be the kind of thing that reside in the physical world of space and time. So all of these things, it's hard to see how they fit in. But I think consciousness is, in my view, perhaps the most interesting, because with all these other things, it's at least an option to say maybe it doesn't exist. Maybe we're not really free in the way we think we are. Maybe there aren't really facts about right and wrong. Maybe it's just expressions of our preferences. Maybe mathematics is a sort of useful fiction. Some philosophers defend that. But with consciousness, not only is it hard to fit in, but it seems so hard to deny the phenomenon, to say that nobody's ever really felt pain or seen red, or that just seems intolerable. The reality of our own experiences seems more evident than anything else. It seems if I'm in pain, the reality of my own pain is more evident to me than this table in front of me. So it's both so hard to deny, but also so hard to fit into our standard picture of reality. But in terms of my own, I guess I've just been fascinated by the problem from when I first started studying philosophy. And when I studied philosophy, we were taught that there were only two options, basically the two options you briefly outlined in your introduction there. Dualism on the one hand, that consciousness is non-physical, outside of the physical workings of the body and the brain, maybe in the soul. And on the other hand, materialism, that we just identify experiences with the kind of electrochemical signaling in the brain. And I came to think that both of these options were deeply flawed. In fact, I became so disillusioned, I just left academia, didn't want anything more to do with it, tried to think about other things. But then I came across this strange sounding middle way option, almost by accident, in fact, when I was trying to distract myself with other things, which seems kind of unusual and seems bizarre, but I think avoids the deep difficulties of those more traditional options, and offers us a way forward. And in, I guess, the 15 or 20 years since then, it's really become a view that academic philosophers and even some neuroscientists are starting to take very seriously as a very credible option. It's incredible how the views change from being kind of laughed at or not even thought about at all to being taken as a very serious option. So it's quite exciting times.
Before we dive into this and other topics, I wanted to take a step back and actually explore a bit more on the role of philosophy for answering this question. I mean, one can argue that, say, science has a lot to say, or potentially, say, neuroscience may have a lot to say about this. So, what role do you see philosophy playing in clarifying this question, or any other aspect of helping just make sense of consciousness and why it exists?
I think that's a very important question, because I think a common reaction is to say, okay, there's a challenge here explaining how the brain produces consciousness or something. But most people would say that's a scientific question. Let's just leave it to scientists, neuroscientists, to carry on investigating the brain, and we'll one day crack it. And as long as that's how you're thinking about it, of course, you're never going to take dualism or panpsychism seriously. And I often feel I'm talking at cross purposes with people, because if the problem of consciousness was a purely scientific question, then I agree, the kind of view I pursue would just be would not be something we'd consider. But actually, I think this isn't really entirely a scientific question, at least not of a straightforward form. And the way to see that is just to note that consciousness is not publicly observable. Right. You can't look inside someone's head and see their feelings and experiences. Whereas the task of science in almost all cases is explaining the data of public observation and experiment. So science deals with things we can't observe, like fundamental particles, the quantum vacuum, maybe. Scientists postulate things that are not observable, maybe even the multiverse. But they do so in order to explain what we can observe. The explanatory project is always explaining what is publicly observable. That's not the explanatory project in the case of consciousness. Fundamentally, the thing we are trying to explain is not publicly observable. We know about consciousness not through observation and experiment. It's not something someone discovered with an experiment. We know about it through our immediate awareness of our feelings. If I'm in pain, I'm just directly aware of my pain. You can't see it. You can see my behavior, but you can't see my pain. So it's just a completely different explanatory project. So you've really got, that's really the starting point. And so that's not to say it's not partly a scientific question, mm-hmm. because so one thing we want to know is how conscious experience is correlated with brain activity. And that's a scientific question. We do that by scanning people's brains and asking them what they're feeling. Perhaps, if we can, stimulating bits of brains and asking people what they're feeling. So we can't observe consciousness, but we can ask people. And then you try to match them up. What kinds of brain activity go along with what kinds of experience? And we try to make that more systematic. So that's an important scientific project. Although it's still a bit an unusual scientific project, because we're still dealing with this unobservable stuff, and we're asking people for their testimony on it. But anyway, it's a scientific project nonetheless. But that's not the end of the story, because we then want an explanation. Why is it that brain activity is correlated with experience? Why should that be? That is not a scientific question. That is not a question you can answer with an experiment. All you can do with experiments is just establish more correlations. So at that point, we just have to turn to what is philosophy, or what is now philosophy. I hope it will one day be established. The methodology will be established enough to call it science. The subtitle of my book is Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. So I think it becomes science when the rules of the game are agreed upon. But at the moment, it's the realm of philosophy. We just have to look at the various proposals philosophers have offered for saying what's going on in reality that explains those correlations between why brain activity goes along with experience. We just have to examine the various models, the various theories, and try to work out the simplest, most coherent, empirically adequate theory. So it's partly a scientific question, but also crucially, because consciousness is not publicly observable, it's also very much a philosophical question.
Yeah. I think one of the difficulties of talking about consciousness is, sometimes, it can be hijacked for many hand-wavy explanations, especially due to spiritual or religious sort of perspectives. And what I hear from you is what philosophy can bring is a lot of rigor to very high-level sort of ideas. And what science can help with is grounding philosophical arguments into reality. So it's really sort of a mutually beneficial sort of a project in which philosophy and science can help bring a lot more rigor to hand-wavy explanations like, for example, universe is conscious, which may or may not be true, but it doesn't really help because it's such a vague statement.
Yeah, that's right. So there are these spiritual connotations, especially with panpsychism and I just put my phone on silent, with panpsychism and consciousness in general. But I mean, a lot of the philosophers defending panpsychism, like David Chalmers or Luke Roelofs, are, total atheist secularists. They don't believe in any transcendent reality, but they do believe in feelings and experiences. And they think we need an account of how they fit into reality. So yeah, you're right. I think an important role of philosophy is bringing rigor. And that's the case in general, I think, that's much neglected, that's the philosophical skill of bringing kind of rigor and clarity. But particularly with consciousness, I think there's even more of a role in philosophy than usual. It's not just we add rigor, but then ultimately we settle it with experiments. I think in this case, because the fundamental datum, the fundamental thing we're trying to explain is not publicly observable, it's very much a philosophical question, at least a theoretical question, not a question we can answer with experiments. And people get a bit, in connection with what you just said, people get a bit nervous if you can't settle it with an experiment. How do we do it? What do we? And I understand that, but because consciousness is not publicly observable, that's just the nature of the topic. So we either pretend it doesn't exist, as people did for many decades of the 20th century, or we accept it does exist. We know it exists because we're immediately aware of it, and we just try to find the simplest, most empirically adequate account of how it fits into reality. And that might not be true. We can't, even things we can prove with experiments might not be true because we might be in the matrix. But, any theory we come up with might not be true, but at least if it's the simplest theory that can account for the data, including the reality of consciousness, then we can say, I think it's the best guess humans are capable of.
Okay. So let's get to the main topic and the biggest question, which perhaps we all know intuitively, but again, capturing it exactly is difficult. But I'm gonna ask it anyway. What is consciousness? What's your definition of it?
Yeah, that's an important starting point. I just wanted to add something else on the last question, actually. People worry about rigor. I think an important thing is the peer review system that, is an important way that weeds out a lot of kind of very, very ill thought out and not. So that's important about, when you're thinking, we're losing control. I think that is a real worry when we're trying to talk about panpsychism and consciousness. But, I think, and that's part of the reason panpsychism is being taken more seriously, is it has got through that rigorous peer review process, and there's lots more publications on the topic. But anyway,
that's an important point. I want to underscore, it's not some particular person's opinion. It's a community, and that community keeps each other at a higher standard of reasoning.
Yeah, yes, of course, it is. It's not like there's any consensus on the truth here. This is very much a debatable topic. but the community at least ensures that when papers are published, they're of a minimal standard of, coherence, knowledge of the topic, that there's some kind of reasonable argument here. It's not hand wavy, as you put it. Yeah. So what is consciousness? It's a very ambiguous word. People often use it in lots of different ways. People often use it to mean awareness of one's own existence. I often find that people attach that meaning to it. But the way I use it and the way it's often used is just to mean subjective experience, pleasure, pain, seeing color, hearing sound, any kind of experience. These are all forms of consciousness. So this isn't something specific to humans. I would say rabbits have some kind of subjective experience of the world around them. If you kick a rabbit, if you're cruel enough to kick a rabbit, it feels pain, feelings, experiences. That's all we really mean by consciousness. So some people say, you often hear people saying, it's a mystery what consciousness is. I don't like that way of putting it. I think it's obvious what consciousness is. If we're just talking about experience, nothing is more familiar than one's own experiences. The challenge is how to fit it in to our overall theory of reality.
Yeah. So consciousness is just immediately available to us, like you said, pain and pleasure and colors and so on. But despite that, there has been a history of thought which says consciousness doesn't exist, like you alluded to previously, and even contemporary philosophers, notably Daniel Dennett and others, still deny consciousness exists. So can you talk about why would anyone believe that? And there are, of course, lots of smart people, and they are smart. So why would they think consciousness wouldn't exist?
Yeah, that's a good question. A close friend of mine, Keith Frankish, is one of these people. Yeah, I think we're going to do some philosophical things to do together in the near future. So some people think, oh, this is just a ridiculous view. We shouldn't even take it seriously. And sometimes I annoy my fellow panpsychists or anti-materialists by taking these views seriously. But yeah, I suppose in a way, there's a deep commonality between the people who deny consciousness, now referred to, the name that's caught on is illusionists. I think it was Keith Frankish who coined this phrase. So the idea is that consciousness is an illusion, a trick the brain plays on us, making us think we're conscious when we're not really. So I think, Keith and I both agree that we can't explain consciousness in conventional scientific terms. I've already pointed to one reason for that it's not publicly observable. So we both agree on that. So I say, well, we need to expand our understanding of what science is in order to deal with it. Whereas he says, well, that shows it shouldn't exist. It doesn't exist, rather. It's like magic or fairy dust or something. We should reject it. But part of this, I suppose, is, I don't say specifically about Keith, but I think part of the motivation is people thinking, look at the success of science, the wonderful technology it's produced. And I think that has a visceral effect on you, that, wow, this really works, guess they used to think, if you think of magicians of the past attracting people with their tricks and their illusions, impressing people to follow them, what incredible tricks science can do. And it's maybe that's not a great analogy in retrospect. It sounds like I think there's something deceitful about it. It is very impressive. But the reason that the title of my book, Galileo's Error, what I try to do is to set this in a historical perspective. I try to argue the reason physical science has been so successful is because it was designed to exclude consciousness. And Galileo is quite explicit with this. So a key moment in the scientific revolution in 1623, Galileo wants a purely mathematical science, purely quantitative science. But I think he understands that you can't capture consciousness in those austere terms, because consciousness involves qualities, colors, sounds, smells, tastes. When we attend to our experience, I invite the viewer to attend to experience right now, find all of these qualities, and you can't capture those kinds of qualities in the purely quantitative language of mathematics. An equation can't capture that deep red you see as you experience as you watch the setting sun. So Galileo said, well, if we want a purely quantitative mathematical science, we need to take consciousness out of the picture. That's not part of the domain of science. Just focus on what we can capture in mathematics. So that went really well. But the reason it's gotten so well, because it set consciousness on one side. So the fact that physical science went well since we ignored consciousness gives us absolutely no reason to think it's going to go well once we bring consciousness back into the picture. So I think once we're thinking of the reasons for the success of science in the correct way, I do struggle to see the motivation for illusionism. And I mean, there are tricky issues here. We could talk about maybe whether it is strictly speaking coherent or not. But whether or not illusionism is coherent, I would just say the reality of my own experiences. I agree with Descartes on this. The reality of my experiences is even more certain than the reality of the world around me. So I find it hard to see why knowledge of the world around me could give me grounds for doubting the reality of my own consciousness. Although Keith Frankish makes some interesting arguments for it, actually, as a sign of how far panpsychism has come. The big annual British Philosophy Conference, which is the joint session of the Mind and Aristotelian Society, quite a long title. There is going to be a plenary session on panpsychism with Eugen Nagasawa and also Keith Frankish, who will be critiquing panpsychism.
Okay.
But he sort of argues, if you're going to believe in consciousness, that's probably the way to go. But then tries to, with some fascinating arguments, that actually he thinks a proper scientific method should lead us to reject the starting point that consciousness exists. Although, as I say, I struggle to see it.
So beyond, I mean, the academic debate and knowledge of this question is utmost important. But beyond that, how does this question matter, in the sense that taking one side versus the other, what sort of implications that either view has, which actually puts perhaps a moral sort of argument to why one should choose one over another? I mean, is it just purely an academic and abstract interest, or does it really matter?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why does this matter? I mean, the most straightforward reason why it matters is because I think it's intrinsically important to try to have our best guess at what reality is like, the fundamental nature of reality, what this universe we find ourselves in is really like. We'll never know for sure, but I think it's a worthy endeavor to try and have our best guess. Science isn't just about building bridges and curing pandemics, as important as those things are, especially we're all aware of that right now. But it's also about the natural, noble human desire to try to find out the ultimate nature of reality. So that's one reason it's important. But also, I think that this isn't just an abstract puzzle. Consciousness is at the root of human identity. Fundamentally, we relate to each other as creatures with feelings and experiences. It's arguably the source of everything that truly matters in life. Comes from, beautiful visual or auditory experiences, deep emotions, subtle thoughts. This is what life is all about. And I would argue, somewhat controversially, that our official scientific worldview denies its existence. And so to try and make the case for that, I again invite the viewer to attend to the qualities of their own experience, the colors, the sounds, the smells, the tastes. our official scientific worldview tells you all that's really going on in your head is the purely quantitative story of electrochemical signaling. And I think that's really tantamount to just denying the reality of those qualities. So I think we're at a strange time in history where our official story of reality denies the thing that is most evident and the thing that gives human life meaning. I think in 100 years, we'll look back and think, what was going on in that period of history? So as I say, I think it's partly a result, and people will explain it, I believe, as a result of just being so understandably so blown away with success of physical science. Think, oh, that's everything. But I think it will be looked back on as a very peculiar period of human history, and I don't know. I think it can lead to a sense of alienation. That there's a lot of strange things happening in the world at the moment, and I think there are all sorts of straightforward economic explanations for that. But I think one part of it might be this clash between theory and lived experience, that we know there is this subjective, qualitative aspect to our existence, but our official worldview says no. And, maybe part of what Max Weber called the disenchantment of nature, the sense that we don't fit into the universe. So I think we should always be trying to, as I often say, my slogan is, as philosophers and scientists, we shouldn't be looking for the view we'd like to be true, but the view that's most likely to be true. Most of my book is the cold-blooded philosophical and scientific case for panpsychism as the best account of how consciousness fits in to reality. But the last chapter explores its implications for human existence. And I think it does lead to a picture of reality that's slightly more consonant with our mental and spiritual well-being.
Yeah. I think personally for me, deciding which framework of consciousness is most true is important in the moral sense. I mean, I want to know how to treat other things out there. If everything is just functional, then even other humans aren't possibly, the morality gets situated in where you side with this for me. So I want to know whether animals are conscious, whether if a computer program is running which shows intelligence is conscious, whether shutting it down I'm committing a crime or not. So I think knowing what's your view of consciousness, what's your theory of consciousness, definitely has huge consequences on the moral choices you make.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suggest in the final chapter of my book, Galileo's Error, that panpsychism can have profound implications for our relationship to the environment. If you think of it, tree as just a kind of mechanism, then it really doesn't have any value in itself.
Yeah.
We should just be thinking of what good it does for us. But if you think a tree is a conscious organism of a very strange, different kind to us, but still a conscious organism, then I think it has moral worth in its own right. If you see horrific forest fires of the kind we've seen recently, if you think of that as the burning of conscious organisms, there's a whole extra dimension there. But although in a way, I think what you're saying is quite right, but it points more to the more scientific question. So as I think of it, is that the scientific question, which is also partly philosophical, but the scientific question of what's sometimes called the neural correlates of consciousness, establishing what kinds of physical activity go along with consciousness. That's more of an experimental question. The philosophical question then is explaining why certain kinds of physical activity go along with consciousness. So maybe, some of those questions of whether a computer could be conscious, for example, are more in the scientific arena. Although in this area, there's a lot of overlap. If you a particular kind of explanation like panpsychism, if you favor that might have knockback effects on the experimental question. Even the experimental question is subject to all sorts of difficulties and vagaries because the phenomenon is not publicly observable. So certain theoretical benefits to the philosophical theory might change your view of the scientific question as well.
Okay. Okay. So, Dr. Philip Goff, how do you situate historically consciousness in reality? I know we talked about materialism, dualism. Can you talk about these frameworks in a bit more detail, plus why they're not enough, and then perhaps we can try situating panpsychism as hopefully overcoming their flaws?
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. So, what should we start with? Dualism, maybe.
Yeah, sure.
So I guess historically, dualism is associated with belief in the soul, a non-physical thing separate from the body and the brain. René Descartes and Plato both believed in such a thing. Maybe it can survive death. But in contemporary philosophy, what perhaps the most popular option is what David Chalmers, who's maybe the most well-known proponent of dualism in contemporary philosophy, calls naturalistic dualism. So he thinks consciousness is non-physical, but he wants to bring it into the domain of science. He wants to understand it as a natural, law-governed phenomenon. So he doesn't believe in souls. He doesn't believe in non-physical things. He thinks there are just bodies and brains, but he thinks some physical things have non-physical properties or characteristics. Consciousness is a non-physical property of certain physical things like brains. So how does this work? Chalmers postulates special psychophysical laws of nature over and above the laws of physics. So Chalmers thinks if there were only the laws of physics, there wouldn't be any consciousness. There'd just be particles and fields, complicated mechanisms might evolve, but they wouldn't have any experience. They'd just be zombies in the philosophical terminology. But because there are these special psychophysical laws of nature, they ensure that in certain physical circumstances, consciousness arises from the physical circumstances themselves. And so what are these psychophysical laws? Well, Chalmers would say, we should look to neuroscience. So as I said, the neuroscience is trying to establish which conscious experiences which brain activity goes along with conscious experience. Once we've established that, Chalmers will postulate his psychophysical laws to explain that. So that's the philosophical bit. So it doesn't imply post-mortem survival.
Just a clarification so that I understood this right. So does this mean, for example, if something happens in physical world, maybe as a very simplistic example, two electrons existing in a certain position, an experience of red would happen? Is this what he means by psychophysical laws?
Yeah, but so you've given a kind of very...
Not exactly. I mean, this, of course, nobody knows, but something of this character.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just a fundamental fact about our world. So if we, neuroscience might tell us the feeling of pain goes along with a certain kind of pattern of neural firings. Chalmers might say, well, it's just a fundamental fact about our world that when you have that pattern of neural firings, consciousness appears, and there's just basic laws of nature undergirding that. And we probably want to be more systematic. So we have neuroscientific theories that try to tell us what in general is required for consciousness. So the integrated information theory tells us when you have a system with a certain level of integrated information, you get consciousness. So that's the experimental result. Chalmers will say, okay, it's a fundamental law of nature that when you have sufficient levels of integrated information, you get consciousness. That's, so every scientific theory has to stop somewhere. Wittgenstein famously said explanations have to end somewhere. Some people end with the laws of physics. That's just the bottom level story. Chalmers ends with the laws of physics and the psychophysical laws. That's just the bottom line.
Right. So it's sort of like how in physics we take, say, fields, quantum fields for granted. In similar way, and their interactions. I mean, there is no reason per se. It might be just a brute fact of the universe. In a similar way, what Chalmers is suggesting is some interaction of physical entities could produce these experiences just as a brute fact.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, people
But
famously said to Newton, why does your law of gravity hold? Why do things attract with this force? And he said, I don't frame hypotheses. It's the job of the scientist just to say, give these laws, So Chalmers would say, yeah, that's the law. That's the bottom line. No deeper explanation.
But isn't that just the physics itself? I mean, what does psychophysical mean here if you're incorporating more laws into what we already know?
Well, because the psychophysical laws, because the law explicitly connects the physical to consciousness. So the laws of physics don't seem to mention consciousness. They just meant mass, charge, spin. So Chalmers thinks if there were just those laws, there wouldn't be any consciousness. But Chalmers wants to postulate, so if you talk to physicists with their laws of nature, they're proposing, they don't mention consciousness. Chalmers is proposing these special extra laws that do explicitly mention consciousness. So they say, when you have these certain physical circumstances, and it's the job of neuroscience to find out what they are, then you get consciousness. So the law, so it's a sort of input, output, physical in, consciousness out, and that's just explicitly mentioned in the law. And it might go the other way. If you want to have some interaction, it may be my consciousness causes me to do something, then we're going to need psychophysical laws that tell us which conscious states cause which kinds of brain activity or whatever. So it might go both ways.
I was on this, related, I was reading a paper by physicist Sean Carroll. He talked about that for everyday life, we know all the physics. I'm not sure if you came across this paper, but he essentially talks about that for all practical purposes, for everyday life, we know all the physics that's out there, because Large Hadron Collider has investigated physical forces and physical sort of character standard model essentially to a large degree. And his point was that if there was something interacting other than what we know already, we would have found out about that already. And since we haven't, then it according to him, it's impossible to find out anything else other than the physical laws we have today.
Good, yeah. Well, I know Sean's work quite well. I've been on his podcast, and actually your viewers might be interested. There's going to be a special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies on my book, Galileo's Error, various responses to Galileo's Error, published in October. And it has responses by Sean Carroll, who just told me he's writing it right now. And Carlo Rovelli as well, and Christoph Cox. There's going to be some interdisciplinary. So I'm quite excited to see. And then I'll write counter responses. But yeah, so yes, it's important argument. I mean, the great thing about Sean Carroll is he's so philosophically clued up for a physicist. It's very impressive. I don't agree with him, but he knows his stuff, and you can have a sensible argument. But yes, so this is an argument that's often given against dualism, is that if there were non-physical properties like Chalmers imagines impacting on the brain, this would really show up in our physical science. We'd see all these spooky things happening that didn't have a physical explanation. This is often pressed in the philosophical literature by talking of the causal closure of the physical. This is the thesis that the physical world forms a causally closed system. Everything that happens has a physical cause. And then it seems like if consciousness is non-physical, then there's nothing left for it to do. So actually, I have argued for a long time, I've defended this argument that Sean Carroll is giving, and argued that this is a motivation for panpsychism, because, well, I mean, maybe we'll have to get onto it, but maybe I'll just pause that for the moment, because I think this is perhaps a good argument against dualism, but it just doesn't have any traction against panpsychism. So maybe I could explain that when we get to panpsychism. But actually, although I've spent a lot of time defending that kind of line, I'm actually less and less convinced of it, because the more I talk to neuroscientists, the more I think more I realize how little we know about the workings of the brain. I think we know a lot about the basic chemistry, and we know a fair bit about large scale functions of the brain. But what we're very, very ignorant about is how those large scale functions are realized in the basic chemistry, the workings.
Right.
And I think we'd have to really know a lot more about that before we could adequately judge whether there are non-physical influences there. So I don't agree with Sean Carroll when he says that, well, we know the basic physics, so that's enough, because there could be extra laws of nature that appear at the neurophysiological level, supplementing the laws of physics. That seems to me a coherent option. The 19th century British empiricists argued for this. In fact, some neuroscientists argued for this. Kevin Mitchell, who is not a dualist or a panpsychist or anything, but he thinks there are kinds of causation at the neurophysiological level that are not reducible to levels of physics. And so I think some people crudely think, oh, that would violate physics.
Yeah.
I have a blog post actually engaging with Kevin Mitchell on this. I don't think it would be a violation of physics. So there could be more laws of nature at the neurophysiological level, perhaps involving non-physical properties that supplement the laws of physics. So I'm not a dualist, but I'm actually less and less convinced that there is good empirical reason to reject it. What I tend to think now is just, as scientists and philosophers, we try to go for the simpler theory. Dualism is not very, it's a kind of, you've got physical things and non-physical things. It's a profligate, disunified picture of nature. It would be nicer, all things being equal, to have a more simple and unified theory. And I think panpsychism offers us that.
Okay. So having too many entities is why you reject dualism.
Yeah, and there might be empirical problems with it as well.
Okay.
I guess I'm more agnostic on that, but yeah.
Okay. And what is materialism, and again, why do you reject it? And then finally, love to come and talk about panpsychism.
Yeah. So materialism is roughly the idea that conscious experiences just are constituted of electrochemical signaling in the brain. So we can sort of explain consciousness in terms of the chemistry of the brain. So it's obviously a huge debate, but I guess I just think these kinds of explanation are not workable. And the starting point for seeing that is that physical science works with a purely quantitative vocabulary, whereas consciousness, as we've already noted a number of times, it involves these qualities. If you attend to your experiences, these colors, sounds, smells, tastes, I don't think you can capture those qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of physical science, of neuroscience, for example. So really, if you think, if your description of the brain is purely framed in that purely quantitative vocabulary, I think you basically leave out the qualities of our, and hence really leave out consciousness itself. So I really think materialism ends up amounting to a denial of the reality of consciousness, which people like Keith Frankish would agree with, but I can't bring myself to accept.
So materialism is literally, as the name suggests, all that exists is material. And the very fact that our experience suggests there is red, there is pain, pleasure, that it's an evidence for rejecting that view outright.
Yeah, everything that exists is physical, and its nature can be completely captured in the purely quantitative language of physical science. And the reason I deny that is because I think we know from our immediate awareness of our experience that there are things that cannot be captured in that purely quantitative vocabulary, namely our own experience. I think what motivates people draws people to materialism again is this idea: look at the success of science. But I would say that what we're trying to do with consciousness is a very different explanatory task. Yes, science is good at accounting for publicly observable data. Yes, science is good at capturing what can be captured in a quantitative vocabulary, but this is a totally different explanatory task. It's about accounting for this unobservable qualities that we're immediately aware of but are not publicly observable. So once you fully appreciate that, I think there's no reason to think physical science is going to be adequately able on its own to deal with that. It's not what it was designed for. It's not what it's ever had any success with. And I think there are pretty good arguments that we've only really touched on. It's a huge debate to think it, in principle, that cannot be done.
Right. Okay. So what's a panpsychism? Again, we've talked about it, but I'm interested in knowing what's the modern accepted view, the current sort of contemporary view of panpsychism. And if you could also maybe talk a little bit about how it's developed and arrived at that modern view in history, that'll also be a great sort of a context setting for panpsychism.
Yeah, so panpsychism is the ancient view that consciousness pervades the universe and is a fundamental feature of it. But there's been a return of interest in it, I think, because of the rediscovery of certain really interesting work from the 1920s by the philosopher Bertrand Russell and the scientist Arthur Eddington, who was incidentally the first scientist to experimentally confirm general relativity, Einstein's theory of general relativity. Also, Alfred North Whitehead around the same time. And this was forgotten about a long time, but has recently been rediscovered in academic philosophy and is, causing significant interest in publications. And part of my reason for writing Galileo's Error was to just try and get this out to a broader audience, that things are so specialized, and so something can be causing excitement within an academic field, but no one else knows about it. But anyway, so the starting point of Russell and Eddington was that physics doesn't really tell us what matter is. And that's when I first heard that, I thought that was a totally ridiculous claim. But, I love reading popular physics books, and, you seem to learn these incredible things of the nature of space and time and matter. How can it not be telling us what matter is? But their point was, actually, when you carefully reflect, it becomes apparent that for all its richness, physics is confined to telling us about the behavior of matter, what it does. Physics tells us, for example, that particles have mass and charge, and these properties are completely characterized in terms of behavior, things like attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. It's all about what stuff does. But now, intuitively, at least, we could debate whether we ultimately have to accept this, but intuitively, there's more to what something is than what it does. So I like to give the analogy of chess pieces. If you're playing chess, you're interested in what the pieces do. You want to know what moves you can make, what pieces you can take. I've rediscovered chess during lockdown. But now, suppose you collect luxury high-end chess pieces. Then you're interested in the substance of the pieces. You want pieces made of gold or silver rather than plastic or cheap metal. This is what philosophers call the intrinsic nature of a thing, what it is considered independently of what it does. So now come back to fundamental particles. You may very well be interested in what physics has to tell you about what an electron does, but you might also want to know about the intrinsic nature of an electron, what it is considered independently of what it does. And about that, physics just has nothing to say. So it turns out there's this huge hole in our standard scientific story of the universe. So the genius, what's this got to do with consciousness? The genius of Russell and Eddington was to see the connection to the problem of consciousness. So our current scientific approach gives us a purely quantitative description of the brain, and in so doing leaves out the qualities of conscious experience. Paralleling this, our current scientific approach gives us a purely behavioral description of matter, and in so doing, leaves out its intrinsic nature. So putting these together, Russell and Eddington formulated a bold hypothesis. Maybe the qualities of experience are the intrinsic nature of matter, from fundamental particles right up to the human brain. So I mean, it connects with actually something Stephen Hawking said on the final page of A Brief History of Time. He said, even when we get our final theory of physics, it will just be a set of rules and equations. It won't tell us what breathes fire into the equations and gives us a universe to describe. So the Russell Eddington panpsychist view is that it's consciousness that breathes fire into the equations. So it's so, you know, as I like to put it, in the 1620s, Galileo separates out the quantitative from the qualitative. This gives us a way, 300 years later, Russell and Eddington gave us a way of bringing them back together, seeing them as two sides of the same coin. So that's the basic picture. So that, I mean, the basic, what we end up with is the view that fundamental particles like electrons and quarks, the basic building blocks of reality, have unimaginably simple forms of experience, and in complicated physical systems like brains, these come together to form the very complex experience of the human or the animal. So that's the basic.
So when we talk about say the intrinsic nature of an electron being some sort of consciousness, trying to get an intuitive sense of it, does it mean, for example, when electron feels some pull towards a positive charge, it must be feeling, I mean, there must be something to be like an electron when it's getting pulled by a positive charge. Is that what you sort of, in a very rough sense, obviously we'll never know what an electron feels like, but is that what you mean by intrinsic nature?
Yeah. So nobody's saying that an electron has the consciousness of a human being. What it's like to be a human is a very complex affair, you know, rich visual and auditory experiences, deep emotions, complex thoughts. But consciousness comes in many different shapes and sizes. You know, the consciousness of a horse is much simpler, a mouse simpler again. Do bed bugs have experience? If they do, you know, it's much simpler than a human being. You know, as we go to simpler and simpler forms of life, we get simpler and simpler forms of consciousness. For the panpsychist, this continues right down to the basic building blocks of matter, which have unimaginably simple forms of experience to reflect their very simple nature. That's at least if you spell it out in terms of particles. But many theoretical physicists, including Sean Carroll, in fact, prefer to think that the fundamental constituents of reality are universe-wide fields. Maybe fits better with quantum field theory. So if you combine that with panpsychism, then the fundamental forms of consciousness will be the intrinsic nature of those universe-wide fields. My own preferred view, I spell it out in that way. So it might be that they're the fundamental conscious things, these universe-wide fields, rather than middle things. But either way, we have these very simple forms of consciousness. Yeah.
So dualism also sort of suggests that certain physical things are equivalent to conscious experiences. How does this really differ? In what ways does it differ, and why do you reject dualism? Because obviously materialism rejects consciousness outright, but dualism at least acknowledges it, and it connects it to physical reality in a very similar way panpsychism does. So how would you contrast these two views?
So dualism thinks of consciousness as different to the physical. We've got fundamentally two different kinds of thing, the physical properties of my brain and these consciousness properties. And that's where we start to get the worries, like as you alluded to, Sean Carroll, for example, of we don't seem to see any sign of these non-physical properties.
Okay.
But panpsychism is not dualistic at all. So this is very important. People often interpret it dualistically. They think, oh, we're saying the particle has its physical properties like mass, spin, and charge, and these consciousness properties. And then we'd think, well, they don't show up in physics. But that's not the view. The view is that mass, spin, and charge are forms of consciousness. You think, what? How does that make sense? But the thought is, physics doesn't tell us what mass is. It just tells us what it does. Physics gives us these equations that tell us what mass does, but it doesn't tell us what mass is. So that leaves open the theoretical possibility that mass is a form of consciousness. So we totally avoid this problem of seeing no sign of non-physical properties. So the physicist Sabine Hossenfelder had a blog post critiquing panpsychism that got a certain amount of traction about a year ago, where she was interpreting it in this dualistic way and saying we see no sign in physics of these non-physical properties. But that just misunderstands the view. It's not dualistic. It's that physical properties are forms of consciousness. Simple physical properties are simple forms of consciousness. Complex physical properties are complex forms of consciousness.
Right. So what something does and what something is just two sides of the same coin. It's the same entity.
That's right. Yeah. That's two perspectives on the same reality. Physics tells us what the stuff does, but what they are talking about are forms of consciousness. They don't know they're forms of consciousness. Just like when you're playing chess, you might not know what the pieces are made of. You can still play the game. Similarly, physicists are not aware that they're talking about forms of consciousness, but that's just because they're interested in playing the game, i.e. the causal principles which govern nature.
Right. So I know we are almost at the end of the time, but I did want to ask one last thing, which is what are the remaining sort of projects for panpsychism? And those projects obviously would come from the sort of challenges of panpsychism. And one of the obvious ones that you point in your book is the binding problem, which is really how does a complex consciousness arrive or sort of arise out of simple ones. For example, I don't feel my liver being conscious, but I definitely feel my brain being conscious. So can you talk a little bit about where you feel panpsychism, how panpsychism has to develop and address its flaws in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of work to be done, and it's exciting to see scientists and philosophers coming together to make progress on these issues. So yeah, the central one, I suppose, is what the binding problem or the combination problem. As you say, how do we make sense of? We ultimately want to explain human and animal consciousness as being derived from more basic forms of consciousness. How do we do that? So there are, broadly speaking, two approaches, which I call strong and weak emergentism. So the strong emergentist postulates extra principles of nature, a bit like David Chalmers' psychophysical laws, fundamental laws that bridge the gap. So you might just have a fundamental law that when conscious particles are arranged in a certain way, you get consciousness corresponding to the system as a whole. Or the reductive panpsychist, or the weak emergentist, tries to do without those extra laws. They try to say just combining conscious particles in the right way, thereby is sufficient to get you a conscious system. And there are really interesting, developments of both sides of this. So some people say, well, doesn't this get us back to all the old worries? Because if we take the strong emergentist route with these extra laws of nature, you might think there's these extra forms of consciousness popping up in the brain. Wouldn't we observe them empirically as we study the brain? Or you might just think, why not just be a dualist like David Chalmers if you can have these extra laws? On the other hand, if we have the more reductionist picture without extra laws of nature, people think there's a sort of explanatory gap there, a little bit reminiscent of the explanatory gap with materialism. Materialists have this problem. How do we get from the quantitative properties of physical science to the qualities of consciousness? The reductive panpsychist has the trouble. How do we get from conscious particles to a conscious system? But I think in both cases, the problems are more tractable because So with the strong emergentist picture, as I've said, I'm more and more skeptical that we do have empirical, because we know so little about the workings of the brain, that we do have empirical grounds for knowing whether there are extra principles of nature bridging the gap from the cellular level to the neurophysiological level. We're only 70% of the way through understanding the maggot brain. So, I think people sometimes get very excited by brain scans, but it's kind of very low resolution there. They're not really telling us, what's going on at the cellular neuronal level. But also, why not just be a dualist? I'd say still panpsychism, even if we have extra laws of nature, it's still a much more simple and unified picture of reality than dualism. We don't have this division in nature between two fundamentally different kinds of property. And then also on the reductionist side, people like Luke Roloffs, who has an excellent book, Combining Minds, have made progress on this issue. And I think there's more reason to have hope than in the materialist case, because at least with both sides of the explanatory gap, we're dealing with the same kinds of concept. The materialist is trying to bridge a gap between purely quantitative objective properties and qualitative subjective properties, whereas the panpsychist is just trying to bridge a gap between simple forms of consciousness and complex forms of consciousness. So there's less reason to think we can't bridge that gap. But actually, finally, what I've developed, even if you do think both of those options are non-starters, I've developed a sort of a hybrid account. So this is really getting into the technicalities now. There's a paper on my website, How Exactly Does Panpsychism Explain Consciousness? So my hybrid account, we're strong emergentist about minds, subjects, what are technically called subjects of experience, the things that have consciousness. But we're reductionist about their conscious states. So there are basic laws of nature that say in certain physical circumstances, a new mind emerges, a new subject of experience. But when that new mind emerges, it doesn't come with brand new forms of consciousness. Rather, it inherits streams of consciousness from the level of physics. So I think this allows us to bridge the explanatory gap by appeal to fundamental laws of nature, but also because these new subjects are inheriting streams of consciousness from the level of physics, this explains why the brain behaves in the same way as a physical system without emergent consciousness. It accounts for these empirical concerns. It accounts for why we don't seem to see new properties emerging in the brain, because on this view, there are no new properties emerging from the brain, that just the properties of fundamental physics sort of move up a level, as it were. So I think, anyway, so there are three options, and right. I think it's exciting, it's early days and working them out, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, and working in a fundamentally interdisciplinary way. So yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah, what panpsychism has given is at least like light at the end of the tunnel of being able to sort of potentially explain such a big fact of our experience. The only fact perhaps we know for sure, like you said. And I'm sure next couple of decades are going to be very exciting for you and the entire sort of consciousness community in philosophy and science. And personally, I'm very excited to see all the progress we're going to make. So thank you. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to chat to you.
Bye-bye. Take care.